In this video, we're going to dive more deeply into understanding what are the specific powers and responsibilities of the state government. So that's what we're going to do right now with our state spotlight. And to get us started, I want you to go back in your mind and remember what it was like during the year 2020. And I bet if you think about it for a little while, you could think about how things were different that year with the onset of the COVID pandemic. What were some of the policies that governments were pursuing at that time? And when I talk about this, I'm not talking about how difficult of a time you had getting toilet paper, although I know that probably happened. What I'm talking about is, what did the government do where you were living? Now, for many of you watching, you'll remember things like stay-at-home policies. Maybe there was an order to stay at home. There was a transition in many parts of the country to online education. Maybe you yourself were a student and you had to finish the school year entirely remotely. Maybe you even took your class over Zoom or something like that. If you walked around, a lot of the different places had requirements when it came to masking. We had restrictions on businesses. We even had rules about how people could come together and worship, different prohibitions on maybe singing or chanting at churches and synagogues and other places of worship. Vaccination policies, right? Some areas had vaccine mandates and others did not. And if you think about that period of time, there were a lot of policies. I'll tell you a little story about myself. Around October of 2020, my family and I, we live in Los Angeles County, but we took a trip to Houston, Texas. And at the time in California, there were quite a lot of restrictions because of COVID policies. So, you weren't able to eat indoors at a restaurant. Playgrounds were closed. In fact, they actually took the hoops off of basketball courts and things like that to try to reduce the amount of people who were outside. And at the time when I went to Houston, what I noticed was there was indoor dining, playgrounds were open. It was very different. There were places like California and New York that had pretty strict requirements when it came to COVID in the name of public health. And there were other states like Texas and Florida that had less restrictions. So it really mattered where you lived during that time. And why didn't we just have one national policy? It seems like that would be a lot easier, instead of having all of this mix of different policies from here to there. Sometimes different counties even had different policies. Why didn't we just pursue one policy for the whole country like a lot of other nations in the world did? And the reason is because if you look at the Constitution, what does it say about what to do during a pandemic in terms of public health? It doesn't say anything. So remember the reserved powers, the 10th Amendment. If it doesn't say anything, we should assume that the states get to decide. And that's why the states were so important during that period of time. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about state powers. And one of the most important powers that a state has is something called police powers. And I know you're already thinking about this police officer right here, right? If you hear that word police powers, you think that it has to do with the police. And guess what? That is part of it. But when you hear that term police powers, I want you to think bigger. Police powers is not just about the police showing up at your door or the police arresting somebody. When it comes to police powers, we're not just talking about police officers. We're talking about the power of states and state governments to create laws that have to do with a number of different things. We're talking health, like we just talked about, and safety, like we just talked about. But we're also talking about things like morality, enforcing some sort of notion of morality on the public, and looking out for public welfare. So why don't we kind of go ahead and dig a little bit deeper? Most of you who are watching this video right now live in LA County. And if somebody from outside of LA County asks you what 4th of July was like here, it gets crazy, right? I guarantee that somebody on your block, maybe even somebody you know, was setting off really large fireworks, right? And it gets crazy. I mean, my neighborhood, people are sending off all kinds of fireworks, even the illegal kinds, right? So, here in California, if you get caught setting off illegal fireworks, you are going to be paying a pretty large fine because it's illegal in California to do that. But if you get in your car and you drive over the border into Nevada, you can legally purchase those same fireworks. Why? Because different states have different laws. This is going to be an example of the police powers that we're talking about here. What does police powers cover? Well, they cover at least four categories of really important things. We're going to start with safety. Think about the last time you interacted with a first responder. Maybe it was a police officer or a firefighter. They're not employed by the federal government. They're likely employed by your city or your county, and they typically get their funding from those areas, maybe getting some funding from the state government as well. And that's because when it comes to safety, the state governments are really in charge of that. Most of our law enforcement, most of our firefighters, it's through the state of California in our case, or other states if you live elsewhere. Think about traffic enforcement. If you're speeding, if you're going 200 miles an hour on the freeway, you're probably going to get pulled over by who? California Highway Patrol. Okay, it's not the national government. It's the state governments that gets to set the traffic laws and to also enforce them. By the way, traffic violations are the number one biggest source of cases within the California legal system. What about that fireworks example we just talked about? Well, the reason for the policy in California is, of course, public safety, right? They don't want people's houses burning down or people getting injured. And so that's going to be another area of states setting laws with respect to safety. Now, morality, you might be thinking, well, what do you mean there? Here you see a picture of a bartender. And when we think about substances, oftentimes that is something that is cause for considerations of morality. Some people drink and they get abusive. Sometimes these substances, including alcohol, can ruin people's lives. So it makes sense that we have some sort of limits on how this stuff is handled. We're going to talk about alcohol a little bit more on the next couple of slides. So why don't we focus more when we're talking about morality on the issue of drugs? Have you ever noticed that some states are pretty lenient if somebody is caught with possession of a substance? They might not really be getting that harsh of a punishment, whereas you go to some other states and you might be facing some pretty serious jail time. That's, again, going to be one of these examples where states kind of get to decide in this issue of morality. Gambling, prostitution, these are other big areas of public morality that states get to decide. In California, you can't really gamble unless you go to a Native American casino. But once you drive over that state boundary to Nevada, you can gamble just about anywhere. That's because, again, the states get to decide in terms of morality. We talked a lot about public health on the previous slide. It's not just about COVID policy. It also includes things like vaccination policy. In California, if you want to attend school, K-12, you have to be vaccinated. If you go to some other states like Texas, for instance, you can get an exemption if the parents don't want to vaccinate. That's because, again, public health is left up to the states. This also includes things like the restaurants. If you live in LA County and you walk up to a restaurant, you might see a big letter on the door or the window of the restaurant. If you see a C, you're not feeling very good about it. That means there might have been some health code violations. If you see a big A that's up on the door or the window, you're probably feeling a little bit better about your lunch. Why? Because that's a state thing. This is actually not something that you'll find everywhere. Every state gets to decide how they enforce those public safety, public health rules with respect to restaurants. See, I told you that police powers covers a lot more than just the police officer showing up. All of these things are parts of police powers. The last one that we're going to look at has to do with family law. This is going to include things like marriage, divorce, and adoption. Marriage, how old do you have to be to get married? It depends on what state you live in. The states get to set that. Also, when you get married, you're typically registering with the state. When I got married to my wife years ago, we ended up getting married and we had to file paperwork in the county of Los Angeles at a courthouse. We never registered our marriage with the federal government. We did that with the state. And when people get divorced, it's also the state that's handling that through the state courts. Who gets to keep the house, or how are they going to split up the possessions? Who gets the custody of the kids? What does all of that look like? That all gets handled through the state system, and different states have different rules about who gets what in those scenarios. And lastly, we'll look at adoption as well. States get to set the requirements for adoption and set that process. Why don't we just have one national law about adoption? Well, because if you think about it, once again, it's not in the Constitution. And it doesn't say anything about the states aren't allowed to do it. So under the 10th Amendment, we should assume that the states have the power. Again, these are police powers. All right, so you have been listening to me talk for quite some time, and maybe that is making you thirsty. And this next slide, if you're over 21, might make you thirsty too. What do we see here? We see some nice frosty beers. And I promised you that when we talked about the police powers, the ability to regulate public health and safety and morality, that we would talk a little bit more about alcohol. And so that's what we're going to do over the next couple of slides. Now, this is going to be a perfect example of the power of state governments to enforce police powers because it touches upon all of those things. Alcohol can touch upon morality, public safety, public health, and all of this stuff that we've been talking about over the last few slides. Now, if you want to drink in California, let's think about the rules in California for just a second. First of all, you have to be 21 years or older. But where can you buy alcohol? And in California, you can go just about anywhere and buy alcohol. You can go and have lunch, and you can have a beer with your lunch. You could buy it right there from the waiter or the waitress. You can go into the grocery store and there's a whole aisle of beer and wine and hard alcohol, or you can go to a bar and you can buy it there too. So you can get alcohol just about everywhere. One of the big restrictions, of course, is that after 2 a.m., all of the bars shut down and the stores can no longer sell you alcohol until the following day. So 2 a.m., that's, you got to close it. You can't buy any alcohol legally in California. But aside from that, it's pretty open. You can get alcohol pretty easily. But of course, different states, different rules. If you go to Las Vegas, what time does the bar close? Well, kind of a trick question. The bar never closes in Las Vegas. You could probably be there on Christmas morning or the middle of the night, whenever, and you'll be able to drink. The bars never really close in Las Vegas. That's because they have much more permissive rules around when and where you can drink. In fact, on the Vegas Strip, you can even walk around with an open container of alcohol. So even less stringent than California. Now I'm going to tell you a story. This story has to do with different alcohol rules, but it's really more of like a family story for me. Years ago, my family discovered that my dad had a brother that none of us ever knew about. It was like such a cool thing to discover. It turned out that he lived in Mena, Arkansas. And I'm going to show you this map actually in just a moment. So Mena, Arkansas is right about here on the border between Arkansas and Oklahoma. And it's going to be in that red area that you see on the map. And it was a really cool experience because we actually all got to fly out and we got to meet my uncle who lived in the town of Mena. And we were getting to know him and he was telling us about life in his town. And he told us that he lived in a dry county. And I had no idea what that meant. I said, Uncle Emmett, what are you talking about? What is a dry county? He said, in our county, you're not allowed to buy alcohol. And that includes going to the store and buying it. There's no bars in the county. You can't go to a restaurant and get a beer with your meal. It's off limits. And I'd never heard of that before. So I was really interested. I said, Uncle Emmett, I'm sure people around here actually drink. So what do they do? And he said, well, what we do is, we get in the car and then we drive over the state line into Oklahoma. We buy as much alcohol as we need. And then we'll just kind of like bring it back for the week or whatever, and we'll use that. And I just thought that was so interesting because being from California, I'd never really heard about that before. But if you look at this map here, what you see is that there's actually quite a lot of variation across the United States. You have a lot of areas that are considered wet counties, like Los Angeles would fall into that category. But you have counties like where my Uncle Emmett lives where, you don't actually end up, you can't buy alcohol at all. And then you have these other counties that are called either semi-dry or moist counties. And what that is kind of like a blend of both. Maybe there are only certain areas where you can buy it. Or maybe there are, you can get a beer with dinner, but you can't go and buy it at the grocery store. So you have a lot of this variation. Again, this is going to be an example of police powers. And the more you travel around the United States, the more that you'll see that that is the case. We've only got one more slide, and I just put this in here because I think it's really fun. This was actually something that a student showed me about a year ago, and I just thought this was so neat. This is Patrick's Bar and Grill, and it's a really unusual bar because it is located on the border between Copper Hill, Tennessee, which is a wet county, and McKaysville, Georgia, which is a dry county. And so what happens is you walk in, the bar is in the front part, and that's going to be in Tennessee. And so you can buy your alcohol. But if you go and use the restroom, hey, you better leave that alcohol at your table because you are walking in to a dry county where the restrooms are located. The building is kind of like smack dab on the state line. And so this is just a fun example. I mean, it really goes back to show that when it comes to these policies, when it comes to what states are allowed to do, they really have a lot of leeway. The key thing I want you to remember, if it's not in the Constitution, we should assume that the states are the ones who get to decide. That's the key to understanding state powers.